Hello, hello, hello. Please like and subscribe. I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Burley. He's the former head of live political programmes at the BBC, who's written a very, very entertaining, punchy, insightful, enthralling book even, called Why Is This Lying Bastard Lying to Me? That's all right, that's all right, Rob. Check is in the post. Congratulations on the book. A natural writer, I have to say, I was a bit, as an author, I'm always slightly jealous when someone who's, you do have a background in the media, but you've written your first book and it is a very pacey read. Congrats.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I didn't want it to be boring, Owen, because, the danger is people see a book about politics and they think, oh God, that sounds a bit dull or a bit heavy or a bit of work, or I'll buy it and it'll sit on the bookshelf and it won't actually be read. So I tried to make it a few things, really. I sort of peek behind the scenes, which is always fun for people, understanding how we do these things, how what goes on, but also a few jokes now and again, and a story and a narrative to try and kind of hook people in. And it covers a lot of stuff, a lot of ground. But I'm really pleased to hear you say that, because that was the intention exactly.
So it's really because obviously you've always had this passion clearly about politics and about what you could call the political interview. And, obviously, you just so people are aware, a lot of shows people would have watched, like Andrew Marr obviously presented that on Sunday. You had Andrew Neil's various programs, like Daily Politics, Politics Live, all these sorts of shows. Obviously, that was your bread and butter.
Yes.
Now, for those, I'm a geriatric millennial. Brian Walden is a political interviewer who dominated really the whole art of political interview for a long time before my time, before the time of a lot of people watching or listening to this. So just to quickly explain, talk about Brian Walden, because he was a Labour man, wasn't he, from a working class background, but had quite an intriguing relationship with Margaret Thatcher, who obviously dominated politics for the whole of the 1980s.
Absolutely. Brian is a sort of giant in TV, and had an amazing life and an amazing kind of career trajectory. So he, like as you say, he came from West Bromwich. He came from a very, very poor background. His mother died very young, and his father was often unemployed. And he's a guy born in the 30s, he went into politics. He said it's an interesting thing. He sort of said you became Labour because it was in your mother's milk, and that was what you did when you came from the background he came from. But he never really, I don't think he ever really embraced socialism. I think he was really more of a meritocrat and a grammar school boy who felt he was making it, himself, and therefore actually equality of opportunity rather than outcome was kind of where he was possibly at. And so over time he becomes, despite lots of great sort of hopes for him because he was a brilliant orator, as a future prime minister or minister, his parliamentary career never really happened. And he ended up being poached by ITV to come and make a TV show called Weekend World, which was the sort of precursor to the Sunday shows you see now, but very different, much more serious, much more in depth. And towards the end of his time in Parliament, he became sort of Thatcher curious when she became the leader in 1975 of the Tory party, because she spoke to his kind of instincts, which were grammar school boy who made it himself. He was anti-union power, all of those things. And so he came from a particular perspective and became this interviewer. And he was a brilliant interviewer, and he was tough and strong and relentless with whoever he interviewed. But he had a very interesting affinity that was political and became quite personal with Mrs. Thatcher. And in fact, his very first ever edition of that show that he did was Mrs. Thatcher in 1977 as the leader of the opposition. And they talked about union power, and they talked about, and it was an interesting dynamic, perhaps at times uncomfortably close, but also the story arc, as we say when we talk about writing books, was that he went from this position of being her great admirer, and that became deeper and deeper when she was prime minister. But at the end of the 80s, he was the man that delivered an interview with her, a political interview, as you mentioned, which really probably spelt the beginning of the end of Thatcherism. So it was a fascinating. That whole story is dominates the first few chapters of this book, and I hope you enjoyed that.
Before I ask about that particular, because this is a particular interview in 1989 when Thatcher's premiership was spiraling out of control. You had the poll tax, Nigel Lawson's resignation, divisions over Europe and so on. But I mean, there was, I suppose, because one of the things I am interested in is how there can be a problematic closeness between the realm of political journalism and power. And Brian Walden used to sit in Downing Street in the early hours with Thatcher. He was not known. She slept 4 hours a night. So she was often obviously up for a late night chat. But she, you know, he did have a closeness to her. I don't know. Do you look back at that and think, is that the kind of thing which needs to be interrogated? Is maybe how things a demarcation gets blurred?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is in a way the sort of one of the key revelations in the book is that we kind of knew that he was intellectually and politically attracted to her, but he did deliver on air, you know, serious interviews with her that, while sort of sympathetic, did actually achieve something. They told you things about her and her politics, so that was okay. But then these chats you mentioned were one aspect, but the really shocking moment, which I had been rumored, but I've now been able to actually substantiate happened, was in 1983. So Mrs. Thatcher is in 1983, in June of that year, about to run for her second term. And the very last Sunday interview she does is with Brian Walden on ITV. So it's a tough interview, the usual thing. But later that day, and it's a long story, I won't go into all the reasons why, but there's a crisis for Mrs. Thatcher in terms of her comms, because she's about to record her final election broadcast to the country to say, give me a second term. And she doesn't like the script. She hates the script. She needs it changing. And she's racking her brains, and her colleague Ian Gow, who was an MP who worked with her, were racking their brains for who could they get to rewrite this script and really deliver the message. And extraordinarily, they decided to try Brian Walden. And Brian, very unwisely and sort of troublingly, said yes to that when he was called by them as an emergency scriptwriter. So the man that had interviewed her earlier that day on ITV then was writing a broadcast script to be broadcast the following week to the country to say, elect me for a second term. And then after that, assuming she'd win, which she did, he would then continue to go on an interview after that election victory. So that was a very serious misjudgment, it seems to me. I mean, clearly a more than a blurring of the lines.
Shocking.
Yeah, I was shocked. It's a long time ago, but it is shocking to one's image of Brian Walden and of that sort of, and it goes to show this, you know, it's not new, these concerns about that closeness. But anyway, there we are. That's what happened.
Because it was Brian Walden who later, in 1989, when things were really falling apart for Thatcher, and I suppose what happened then, I mean, maybe this is problematic, because actually he did do a very hard-hitting interviewer. He famously suggested she could be off her trolley on national television. Yeah. But that's because he personally come to regard her as becoming a kind of Napoleonic in her demeanour. So it was his own personal trajectory, someone he'd been attracted to politically, but then thought had become overstepping the mark. And that's why in 1989, when Thatcher's entourage maybe expected a sympathetic interview, and they were actually maybe surprised by what they got.
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure entirely by that from this perspective. I think that there was a suggestion, that he made that comment about comparing her to a Napoleon figure, someone who's lost their kind of bearings and just thought that they were kind of, could do anything they wanted. There was obviously that concern was in his head. But by and large, in the run up to that interview in the years before, he was very supportive of her still. And speaking to the people that worked with him on that interview, the team behind it, particularly his executive producer, a guy called David Cox, an absolute giant of political TV in the back room, said that for Brian, this was a choice. He was coming to this interview in 1989. Now, just so people understand, this is 1989. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's been there for 6 years, Nigel Lawson, who's recently died, has just resigned. And fortuitously for ITV, Mrs. Thatcher is scheduled to do an interview with Brian Walden 2 or 3 days later. Some people may have backed out of that, but Mrs. Thatcher didn't do that. To her credit, she did show up for this interview. And all the press talk and all the media talk and all the bubble talk at that moment was, will Brian set aside his own personal and ideological commitment to her that they knew existed and do the right thing and deliver the kind of moment of kind of reckoning that was demanded, because she'd lost her Chancellor. Her argument in the interview was ridiculous about how that had happened and really didn't add up. And Brian chose the right thing. Brian chose the journalistic path. I don't think it was because he'd become disillusioned that he did that. I think his disillusionment may have been partial, but I think essentially he was still where he was. But he knew that this was what he had to do, which is a relief given what he'd done in 1983. So it's important to sort of acknowledge that when it came to it, he did something very damaging and extraordinary. Like you say, you don't call the Prime Minister mad on telly. That's not a thing you do. I mean, I remember I say in the book, if you were around in those days, and you've probably seen the famous clip of her saying we've become a grandmother, or we are now a grandmother, you sort of started to think, people started on the street, people you chatted with, your family, your parents, she's gone a bit mad. We'd say that, but you never say on telly, you know, and he did, and that was shocking and damaging because it was truthful.
I mean, it's interesting. She did have a very otherworldly quality about it. I mean, look, you know, I grew up in a particular family where she was this, if I'm a demonic figure, but I mean, she had this very otherworldly figure. I suppose, I mean, which we'll come on to later in terms of just other politicians, but she was such a, you know, she was an ideological politician of a very particular kind. She once famously slammed down, I think, the Road to Serfdom by Hayek, or something by Frederick Hayek, the kind of one of the godfathers of what we call neoliberal economics, saying this is what we believe. And she saw political interviews, didn't she, as almost a bully pulpit. That's what she would have liked to have seen them, where she could articulate the case, a populist case for neoliberalism. And that was, you know, we're going to free the individual, we're going to roll back to the frontiers of the state. And she actually relished doing interviews because she thought that was a way where she could win the battle of ideas, this big ideological argument, which was going on in the 1980s.
Absolutely. And I mean, she saw herself, I spoke to Charles Moore at length, you know, her official biographer, who was very generous in his time. And she saw herself as a teacher. She saw any opportunity to teach people about her philosophy and help them understand why it was the right one was to be embraced. And so, you know, for me, irrespective of what one thinks of that philosophy, there's something laudable in my eyes about being willing to make the argument. And I think where, you know, to cast forward for a second, Liz Truss, who liked the kind of Thatcherite cosplay of kind of looking, you know, trying to dress a bit like her, getting on a tank or whatever, and sort of aped the idea that she had a radical vision to change Britain economically. She may have had that vision, such as it was, but she wasn't willing to actually argue for it. She didn't come out and be scrutinized after the event that she wasn't really given the fair crack of the whip. Well, you need to come and win the argument. You need to tell people this is going to be difficult, but I think it's the right thing, and I'm going to push ahead, and there'll be suffering, but it'll be the right way to go. Now, look, whatever you think of that argument, that's what you need to do if you're going to argue for radical change. And Mrs. Thatcher did do that. And by the way, earlier when I said it was truthful, I don't mean to say she was mad. I just think that was an idea that was out there. There was a sense that she'd lost her bearings, but she never lost that sense of, you know, this is where I want to argue my case, and I'll argue with anybody about it, and it will be, I'll relish it. And that, I think, is lost a bit. In lots of ways, it's lost in technocratic management politics. It's lost in sort of you know, cowardly, power-hungry populism. So, you know, in that respect, at least, whatever you thought about her in your household, and it was the same in mine, really, you have to hand it to her.
Moving on to what I suppose we call the Rob Burley era. I mean, I would put it to you, you had quite an important role in British democracy, quite a powerful role, because live political programs of the sort we describe were the key forum in which politicians are scrutinised and held to account in various ways. And the manner in which that is done can actually have quite consequential impacts in terms of what happens in democracy and elections and so on. I'm just interested, when you became head of live political programs, what for you was, this is my mission, this is the kind of key set of principles or values which are going to underpin the way I approach this?
Well, I think to go back at the job before, I had Mar Show in 2015, and the Mar Show had sort of been the heir to the David Frost program. I don't know if people will remember that show, which ended in the 2000s, which was a show that very much, they got very big guests, and they didn't have very hard questions. They had a list of questions that were sort of drawn from what was in the newspapers, trying to make news, and that was really their function. They didn't really hide that. And I came to that job, to Mar, thinking this is not really the way it can stay or should stay in an environment, in the media environment, in the political environment we're in that period. So we need to toughen up. We need to ask tougher questions. We need to be a bit more forensic and bring the things that I brought, which was a kind of history and forensic long form political interviews. So that's the kind of thing that Walden did. I did it with Jonathan Dimbleby at ITV. I did it with Andrew Neil at the Sunday Politics. I brought that to Mar, and I sought to bring that as well to the job more broadly when I got to run the whole department. The other thing, and again, it's contested and controversial stuff, is that I wanted to bring voices from across the spectrum into the argument and have arguments. I mean, I was talking about Mrs. Thatcher having arguments. I'm for arguments. That's what I'm basically for. And we need to, there's obviously pitfalls with those things. You need to be careful who you're letting in, and you need to be careful you don't create an environment that's just heat and no light. But I think with, Politics Live, I'm actually pretty proud of that show. I think it's at its best, it can be illuminating and actually have a proper argument and a conversation. So those were the sort of principles that underpinned it.
In terms of, I just want to talk about Andrew Marr, I suppose, because you worked very closely with Andrew for a very long time, Andrew Marr. So I don't like calling people in positions of power by their first names. It sounds excessive.
You've met him, Owen. Don't pretend.
I have met him, yeah, and I personally like him. I suppose I'm just interested. Some would critique. He got critiqued a lot in that position, and some people thought, I suppose, and I think Andrew Neil may have maybe retweeted things along these lines to kind of hint at this, which was, and that Andrew Neil was a kind of Rottweiler and Andrew Marr was soft. But what do you think about that? The approach. That's what he was critiqued. People would say. What do you think about that?
I think that it's. Look, you're going to be critiqued. I mean, the bottom line is you will be critiqued all the time. That's going to happen, whatever. So I think it's not right. I mean, Andrew Marr, like I say, the show that I inherited was a bit more of a kind of genial Sunday morning sofa show, and it wasn't going to lose that feel, because you don't really want a kind of Andrew Neil style haranguing interview at 9 o'clock in the morning.
You got a hangover, all the kids running around.
Yeah. It's like, stop shouting, Andrew. So it's not going to be like that. But as I say, what I did was to try and just increase the extent to which we were forensic and we asked tough questions. And I would say this, but having for this book gone back to a lot of our material, I feel quite happy about what we did, and both in the Brexit campaign and also in terms of our scrutiny of politicians. When you put you put David Cameron on in the, I mean, you think by the critique, one of the critiques, that we sort of, the austerity period, as it were, it's not ended, but it was kind of launched in that period, David Cameron, George Osborne, that somehow we didn't scrutinise that or put them under pressure or only argued with the Labour Party about whether they were going to do something about the deficit. Whereas in fact, what we did was we talked about the real world effects of those policies. And there were quite revealing moments. There's a moment in an interview with David Cameron, which features in the book, where we bring up the case of a guy called David Clapson who died after being sanctioned. And had worked his whole life. This was a guy who died with a pile of CVs by his side because he was trying desperately to get a job. This was a guy who was slightly baffled by the online system he was now faced with because he was of a different generation. And this is a guy who died. There's been no proper inquest, but we were able to say to him, what happened to him in the system, David Cameron, contributed almost certainly to his death. And we raised that with him, and it was very revealing. And his family were very upset by David Cameron's response, which was a sort of offhand, Flashman-esque sort of, these things happen approach, rather than a curiosity about, hang on, I've established a system here, which I think is a good idea, but people might be dying. And I thought that was revealing. And that's the kind of thing we did on Sunday morning at 9 in the morning. So I don't really accept it. I think with, people are going to say what they're going to say. All I know is we did the job well, as far as I'm concerned, and we did it in an appropriate way, given that particular format. It would be different in an Andrew Neil show, a bit more forensic, a bit more hard hitting. Does that make sense? Yeah,
it does make sense. Yeah. With just in terms of closeness to power, one of the things I mean, again, which because we talked about Brian Walden and Margaret Thatcher, and I suppose how one of the problems with Westminster-based political journalism is it can end up being maybe a bit incestuous. I mean, there are actually examples of journalists and politicians becoming quite close friends. You might think, well, how do you avoid that? They work in the same circles, they go and socialize, but sometimes going on holidays, sometimes being godparents to each other's kids. I mean, you do get these examples. And I'm just one example, because I found this interesting with Andrew Marr, who actually apologized recently in a way I thought was commendable about and this, to be clear, this is back in 2003 when he was working as a BBC's political editor. It wasn't when you were working at the BBC. But just as an example, when Baghdad fell in the Iraq War, and he did a very notorious piece to camera in which he just lauded a huge victory, basically said everything Tony Blair's done has been completely vindicated. All his critics have been humiliated. His critics, obviously, they're only human, so they won't admit that they've been completely and utterly proven wrong, but they will come to, and the Prime Minister is walking on water. But what the reason I bring that up is the problem there, I think, was you get this closeness often between key political journalists and politicians where they're almost embedded, because we got this phenomenon of journalists being embedded in conflicts in armies, and they almost end up then seeing themselves as being part of the army. Do you see what I mean? I mean, do you think there's a basis, a justification for that critique? And do you see it as a structural problem with Westminster political journalism?
Yeah, so I'll try and answer. I can't really say very much about Andrew's piece to camera in 2003, really. But I mean, I suppose, and I don't know if that's evidence of closeness or evidence of, especially with the benefit of hindsight, getting it, wrong. I mean, there's no, to say that the Blair position on Iraq was vindicated, would be wrong. But he was saying something at the time. It appeared, anyway, whatever. I can't really answer for that, and he's apologised for the misjudgment. So I can't really say also that was to do with closeness. But I do think there is a problem with closeness. And I do think it's hard to stop people socializing, stop people becoming close. I suppose in my case, because I sort of always I never really felt part of all that. When I was, despite reaching that level, I was kind of not hanging out with these people. And I didn't really want to hang out with them. I didn't dislike them as people necessarily, but I didn't want to be infected too much about understanding too well their own sort of problems, because it's really not about them. It's about the people of the country who are being governed and what happens to them and where the decisions affect them. It's not about, we need to make allowances because, politician X, Y, and Z has all these great sort of burdens. So there was that for me. I didn't really do that. And also, I mentioned in the book, there was an occasion I won't go into the whole story, but there's an occasion in the 90s when I'm on the Jonathan Dimbleby show on ITV, and Paddy Ashdown, the late Liberal Democrat leader, sort of castigated my own research on air, which was quite scary at the time, because suggesting that I'd got something wrong on air. And then in the green room afterwards was, just sort of said, sorry about that, just had to say something to get out of the hole. And it was just like, oh, so it's a game. And I always wanted to resist that notion that it's a game, because the people who it affects don't understand the rules of the game and aren't in the game. So all of that contributed to my own sort of desire to slightly stand back from too much closeness to people that worked in politics or politicians themselves. So that was my way of resisting what is a danger. It's harder for people who make the news shows, like the actual bulletins, putting out those, they're covering minute to minute what's going on in Westminster, what the story is. They become quite close to politicians because they're looking for stories, they're looking for access, whatever. And they speak to them a lot. So they speak to them perhaps, every morning during the Today programme, or late at night after the news at 10 or something. So it's quite a dangerously close relationship. And, what I thought was valuable earlier on in the BBC's history was that there was more than one person who was interfacing with politicians. And you made sure that you weren't just, you weren't risking an individual becoming too close to a particular group of people in power. I'm not saying that happened, but that is the risk. That's the danger you have to guard against. And the BBC, obviously, because of cuts, which are not really their fault, have had to strip away all those people who were a safeguard against. Oh, something's fallen over. Okay. Who are a safeguard against that danger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the closeness, I suppose it's interesting that the right-wing media in this country will often call the BBC a den of leftiness. I'd put that.
Yes.
The reason they say that is because they almost so used to being so dominant within the media industry that they regard anything that's in right wing as a violation of neutrality. And also the BBC does have responsibilities to present different sides of the argument, and clearly not couch its argument, present information like the Daily Mail or the Sun would, clearly. But what I'd put to you is there is a revolving door between the BBC and the Conservative Party, which is an established fact. So Boris Johnson hired Gito Harry from the BBC. Your predecessor as head of live political programming. What was it? Why have I just forgotten his name? Robbie Gibb. Robbie Gibb. So Robbie Gibb started off at the BBC. He then ended up at the Conservative Party. He worked for Francis Maude. He was Shadow Chancellor. His brother, I mean, can't really hold that against him, is a Conservative politician. He then ended up at the BBC. He then ends up being poached by Theresa May as a director of communications. He then goes off to launch GB News. And then goes back to the BBC on the BBC board and is accused by Emily Maitlis, a senior BBC journalist, when she leaves, of being an agent of the Conservative Party within the BBC. You've got George Osborne hired Thea Rogers from the BBC, ended up marrying her, funny enough. David Cameron hired Craig Oliver, one of the most senior figures in BBC News. It is like an endless revolving door between the BBC and the Conservative Party. I mean, don't you see that? Isn't that very problematic?
Well, I mean, I guess it speaks to the often to the closeness of the two. And as I say, I will defend my own approach to that, which was to not be close to parties. But I mean, I think the only thing I would say about that is I don't think it's about the Tory party and the BBC. I think it's about the party in power or coming to power and people at the BBC wanting to work for them. Because, I'm just trying to think. We had. I remember Lance Price going to work for Tony Blair. We had Gavin Davis becoming the chair of the BBC. We had James Purnell sort of running between the two things. I don't think it's unique to the Tory party at all. I think there are people in political television who are political, sometimes in a way that's quite sort of agnostic. I think about. In terms of where they stand, they're attracted to power. So if like I say, if Tony Blair is the coming man, then they're likely to jump on the new Labour train. And so, because I don't actually think, to be honest, I don't think it's accurate to suggest that the BBC is not perfect. It's not right leaning. I don't believe. I mean, obviously, that depends where you set right. Okay, but I don't think it's Tory leaning. I think it's kind of centre of gravity in terms of most people who are there is a little bit centre left, really.
A senior BBC presenter put it to me that the kind of main sort of the kind of main dominant political ideology was Blairism. And that's why people. So that would mean on the economy, often supporting free market economics, but on social issues like being maybe pro-immigration. Do you think that was reasonable for a long time at the BBC?
I think it depends who you're talking about, really. I mean, I think there are plenty of people I've worked with at the BBC who weren't Blairites, who were sort of on further to the left than that, and sort of wanted, didn't like. I mean, I wasn't ever Iraq, but since after that, kind of took a view on economic policy that might be more left wing than Blair's. I don't think they identify themselves as that. I think, that's what I'm saying is, in a way, the people I encountered in the broader BBC over time tended to feel to me like they were either centre or slightly to the left, maybe, perhaps to the left of Blairism. And then there's the other people who are the more ambitious sort of, they might jump into politics sort of people, or the on-screen people, or the reporters. these are ambitious people, and then they have a range of views. I mean, I couldn't really characterize, I don't really think, I could characterize them as Blairite or Tory.
But let me put this to you. Let's do a thought experiment. Experiment, because I suppose the argument there is that the BBC basically is one of the structural problems. Is it becomes too close to whoever is the incumbent in power. So under the New Labour period, it gravitates towards New Labour, and obviously you get appointees who are favourable to the government, though actually you got then they were seen as too critical over Iraq, so they ended up having to resign, which itself, I suppose, raises various questions. And then the Conservatives come to power, so they end up closer to them. I would put it to you that hypothetically, if Jeremy Corbyn had become Prime Minister after 2017, I don't think the BBC ever would have become close to a Corbyn government. So I think that does tell you something, that if it was a right-wing Conservative government or a Blairite
sure I agree with that. Sorry. Where I don't agree with that, I think you think it's coming from an ideological place somehow, and there may be some people who are in that situation. What I think is, I don't think it's about that. I think what it is the government of the day is so important to you if you are running politics at the BBC and anywhere else as well. They can provide you with those stories. They can provide you with interviews with the Prime Minister. it makes sense for you to be cultivating a relationship if you're doing that sort of stuff with whoever the person. If it had turned out to be Seamus Milne, then I'm sure that they would have been, seeking a coffee with him, seeking a drink, wanting to meet up with others, senior people in the Labour Party if there was a Corbyn government. I think it would switch, and there may even be people who are ambitious people who would seek to go and work for that administration because they're in power. So I don't think there was I just don't really buy that. I think that's what drives it. It's access, and the danger is as we've seen. There was a story in the Guardian this year which suggested, it's just anecdotal to an extent, but it featured some messages that suggested that the government's influence could be quite direct in terms of the language being used in output, what the emphasis of certain stories was. And I think that applied not because of an allegiance to the Tory party by anybody in the BBC, but a belief really that they should listen to those people because they're powerful more than they should listen to the opposition because they're not in power. And that is the risk for me, and it's a real risk, and it needs to be examined.
I mean, I am interested just if you have any thoughts on Robbie Gibb, because he was your predecessor and he has been accused by Emily Maitlis and Lewis Goodall, two very senior BBC journalists who weren't obviously under your purview, if you like, but they accuse him of being an agent of the Conservative Party within the BBC. And just, what does that tell us structurally about the failings, I suppose, of the BBC when it comes to being independent of the government?
Well, I mean, I don't know why they say that specifically. That suggests that an activity he's undertaking that's kind of as an agent inside the BBC doing things. I think the reason is because, we have Richard Sharp, the late Richard Sharp in terms of the BBC. In there, we had Tim Davies, got a history of being involved with the Tory party, and there's Robbie Gibb, who's got that background too. So I think it's because of that sense that there are quite a lot of senior Tories. There are a lot of senior people at the BBC who've got a Tory background that you get this kind of concern. I can't really speak to why they would use that particular term about Robbie. He wasn't acting as that when I worked with him. He was somebody who came from a different politics than I came from, but was, he acted in my experience impartially when he was doing the job that I subsequently did. So we had, there were things we disagreed on. I mean, we disagreed after Brexit. There was a conversation I had, which I relay in the book, about, I said the morning after the campaign, I said, we need to be interrogating the veracity of the claims that were made by Vote Leave. And Robbie very much felt that was the wrong thing to do because it was like a rerunning of the referendum. Whereas for me, it was an absolutely fundamental sort of journalistic duty to do that, like you would do with a government that's elected. So we disagreed, and I didn't actually, frankly, I just disregarded his kind of view on that and did what I did. So there was the odd thing, but I didn't see him being an agent of the Conservative Party. But there may be things that Emily's referring to or Lewis that I'm not privy to.
Before I ask about the 2019 election, finally, I want to talk to you about Boris Johnson. And I'd put it to you that Boris Johnson, to me, is in large part a real failure of political journalism. He was clearly not suitable for high office. MPs who made him leader of the Conservative Party didn't think he was fit for office. I remember speaking to one in a BBC green room in 2018 who said there was no way we're going to let, as Tory MPs, Boris Johnson into the final two so Tory members can have a say. He's not fit for office. He's a charlatan. He's a liar, etc., etc. A few months later, that Tory MP recorded his endorsement video, which he posted on social media, about why Boris Johnson was suitable to be Prime Minister and how he was backing him all the way. Now, the point I would make to you is everyone knew Boris Johnson for years was completely a liar, on record, lying over and over again, that he'd had, for example, a recorded interview where his friend suggested beating up a journalist. Now, Boris Johnson just played around with interviewers by putting on this, comic acts, constantly going on tangents. And he did that very, very effectively in a way that frankly seemed to beguile most interviewers. And you could tell that he'd succeeded in doing that because when there was one example, which was Eddie Mair, who stood in for Andrew Marr, famously went for Boris Johnson, listed some of these examples, and actually said to him, "You're a nasty piece of work, aren't you?" And I'd put it to you that if other journalists had maybe taken a tougher line with Boris Johnson instead of allowing him to just play around with him and create this image which allowed him to get away with things that no other politician would have got away with. Their careers would have ended a very long time ago, but he managed to survive being sacked as a journalist, being sacked as a politician, as a, for having an affair, but always managing to come back and end up in high office. Isn't he a failure of political journalism in this country?
Yes, Owen, he is. Yeah. I think that the effect, I relay some of this in the book, the "Have I got news for you" effect, as it were, which was the first thing. And there's a quote which I hadn't discovered before when he talks to Kirsty Walker in a show in, I think, 2008 or something, maybe no, a bit earlier than that. Actually, he's at The Spectator, and he says, he basically says, I play this role, and it's a way of getting my political message across that I play this buffoon role, and that's what I do. So he wasn't even hiding it in a way. I think the problem was, that he obviously used those techniques, and he came into the room as a sort of star who, he's a bit like, Beyonce. He's Boris. He's not even Boris Johnson. He's to be treated. He's treated as good value and a great booking, and that's dangerous. And that people allowed him to play this role of kind of slightly the buffoon, and they fell for it a lot of the time. Now, Eddie Mayer's interview took place in 2013, and it's worth reminding ourselves that, of course, he was referring to a documentary on the BBC, which came out the next week by Michael Cockerell, which outlined all of this stuff. So it was hardly hidden by the BBC. I mean, the BBC actually, to their credit there, did that work. Eddie Mayer, in an absolutely astonishing piece of sort of a takedown, just forensically identified these moments of, untruthfulness, lying, involved in unsavory conversations with his mate about beating up a journalist, all that stuff. And that was really powerful and effective. And actually, even Boris Johnson later that day said it was fair enough. He did very well, Eddie Mayer. But, the question is then, did people carry on with that? All I can say for my part is whenever we had Boris Johnson, and it tended to be on the Marr show, we really very much tried to counter his techniques and not buy into the Bojo nonsense and try and nail him down. And it was really hard. It's effective. And you think,
do you think he was ever nailed down? Was he ever nailed down in that format?
Well, I mean, obviously Eddie did very well with it there. Well,
that's the one example. That's why I bring it up. Yeah.
No. Well, I have another example for you, but on the Marr show, I mean, for example, in the Brexit campaign, there's a moment when he has to acknowledge that there will be an economic hit that we could lose jobs if we vote to leave, which was something he hadn't done before. So Andrew was tried his best to get through the bluster. It's incredibly hard. It's a technique that's very effective. The one, obviously, the very most famous example, apart from Eddie Mayer, where it did happen, was an interview in the 2019 leadership election between Andrew Neil and Boris Johnson. In which it's in the book in great detail. It's probably my proudest moment in TV, which is when you plan an interview and you can plan it very carefully but ahead of time, it doesn't usually go anywhere near how you hope it will. It's usually something happens that just throws things off, and your techniques, your plans have to be thrown away a bit. But we decided in that campaign that Boris Johnson's, his techniques to deal with the risk of no deal Brexit. Do you remember that? Of course. Was to say that he understood the GATT agreement. He'd wheel out the GATT agreement and paragraph 5B of the GATT agreement as being something that offered a safeguard. If we left the EU without a deal, we'd carry on trading with the EU in the same way. So what we did before the interview was we knew that he, like a sort of a student in a seminar with a hangover, could just about regurgitate 5B, the paragraph of the GATT agreement. But we wondered whether he'd understand what 5C said. And of course, he wouldn't have read that far, because he was a chancer. So what we did was we asked him, we allowed bluster about 5B, we allowed the hubris to rise as he thought he really had, he was winning the argument. And then we asked him, and what about what's in 5C? And he had to confess that he didn't know what was in 5C. And he was absolutely exposed in an interview. Didn't matter much to the Tory membership who voted for him a couple of weeks later, unfortunately, in the sense that, that might have been a bit of a red flag.
Yeah.
So it was possible. It was possible. It's easy to say, no one ever landed a blow on him, but I think I can think of those examples off the top of my head.
Just finally, I want to talk about the 2019 election. Quite notoriously, Boris Johnson refused to do an interview with Andrew Neil. And Andrew Neil did interview the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn. And it's fair to say that interview for Jeremy Corbyn was disastrous. I did really, truly spectacularly awful interview, which was perhaps the lowest point of the entire campaign for the Labour Party. Could have lost, because who knows, maybe a few 100,000 votes. That could have cost Labour. The next day, every single newspaper, basically front page, going on about how Jeremy Corbyn's mauled and destroyed by Andrew Neil.
Yeah.
Now, clearly, the fact that Andrew Neil subjected, I mean, you would obviously agree with this, and Andrew Neil did famously. He did a video about this. It was a huge failure. It was a disaster that Boris Johnson wasn't scrutinised in the same way. So, can you just explain how that happened, how that was allowed to happen, and do you think it's fair to say that the Labour Party were actually tricked into doing it because they believed for certain that Boris Johnson was going to be subjected to the same interview?
Okay. In terms of why it happened, just one thing to say, it follows from that interview that we just discussed with Boris Johnson in the leadership campaign. I think after that interview, it was probably clear in the mind of Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane, who were the people running the comms show there for Boris Johnson, that they wouldn't subject him to that again. They learned their lesson from that. So that was, I'm sure that was in their minds from the very beginning. So then what happens is the election's called. There's a package of programs that is offered up to the political parties for agreement. They're the debates, there might be question time specials, and they included in that list of 4 programs, I believe, the Andrew Neil interviews. So that had happened. I wasn't involved in those initial conversations, but I was involved in then subsequent conversations with the parties to try and make the logistical arrangements for these interviews. The way that works, having done this before, is that you never, if you had to get nailed down each date for everybody first, you probably wouldn't make the shows because people aren't willing to do that on all sides. They're reluctant to commit in that way. So you have to sort of start the process. If you can get somebody, you air the show, but you obviously wouldn't do that if someone had told you that they weren't going to do it. So if Boris Johnson's people had said to me that they weren't going to do the show, whatever, instead of saying, yeah, we want to do the show, let's just keep talking about this, which is the customary thing. It's always been done. We want to do the show. It's about finding the opportunity and the time. So I proceeded on that basis. Okay. And so therefore what happened was Jeremy Corbyn fixed a date. Eventually that happened. It went out. Like you say, it didn't go very well for him. And after that, it became clearer and clearer that in fact, those indications that they were acting in good faith and that they were going to do it, if they could make dependent on logistics, were obviously untrue. And in fact, they were never going to do it. And Dominic Cummings has made that clear subsequently in various tweets about the subject. So how did that happen? Well, it turns out, I felt that I had a clear conscience on that because it did trouble me, obviously, because my conversations with them had never said anybody had ever said at any point, we have a firm commitment from all parties and candidates for Prime Minister effectively to do the show. However, that's our plan. We're in genuine talks with everybody. Let's proceed on that basis. And Labour, they did that. Subsequently, I went on. I was on Twitter and being attacked by lots of people after it happened, because in some way I must have tricked the Labour Party into doing this. I don't think they're naive people. They're capable people. I didn't trick them. But what has come to light since then is I've been speaking to Seamus Milne, who hasn't spoken a lot since the election, about the communications that he had with the BBC in those weeks. And it turns out from contemporaneous WhatsApp messages and text messages and the like between Seamus and other people who were senior in the comms team of the party, that they reported conversations with BBC executives more senior than me, in which they were told in terms that Boris Johnson had agreed to doing all that package, that entire package, including the Andrew Neil show. So that's concerning because there's more than one occasion where there are messages saying, I've just had a meeting with the BBC and effectively I've been told that it's all happening, even after Jeremy did his interview. So, and I know after the interview was done with Jeremy, that any pretense their pretense that they were doing it was very half-hearted after that. So that is concerning. I can't substantiate it, and I can't tell you why. It may be that the government. Is it possible that Boris Johnson and his administration lied to the BBC? it's possible, right? That could be the reason. They could have told them they're going to do it, and they didn't mean it. They never told me they were going to do it. I've gone back to them. They maintain they never told anybody that they were going to do it. But somehow that impression very clearly was given to the Labour Party, and I think that's a big problem, actually, because, like you say, it could have had a material effect on the outcome of the election. It was unfair. They waited and pretended long enough to ensure that Jeremy Corbyn did submit himself to the Andrew Neil treatment. It's very dishonourable by them. Obviously, that goes without saying. I just don't understand how that impression could have been given so firmly if it wasn't what was told to them. But I can't really, I wasn't in those meetings.
Of course. Just finally, actually, the final thing I did want to ask is about Andrew Neil. And I know you will very, eloquently defend Andrew Neil as an interviewer. You'll say he will hold all politicians, regardless of their political stripes, to account. He's a Rottweiler. Doesn't matter who they are. But what I'm interested in, though, is that Andrew Neil obviously is unapologetically a very right-wing conservative. I think his beliefs speak for themselves, and his public utterances. What I suppose I'm interested in is he's chair of the Spectator magazine, which is a very right-wing magazine, which has published, amongst other things, articles supporting Greek neo-Nazis, arguing there's not enough Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, articles entitled things like "In Praise of the Wehrmacht." And I suppose the point I would make is, do you honestly think somebody who is as equally left-wing as Andrew Neil, regardless of how good they are as an interviewer, would ever end up in that position if they were chair of a radical left-wing magazine? I'm not talking about the New Statesman, because the Spectator is more right-wing than the New Statesman is left-wing. Would that ever happen? And also, given the Gary Lineker affair, in which Gary Lineker was, done over for violating BBC neutrality, Andrew Neil tweeted all the time, clearly right-wing, shtick, when he was a interviewer. You might say that doesn't infringe on his right, on his abilities as an interviewer, but Gary Lineker was talking about politics, which wasn't even relevant to what he did on television. Yeah. So do you see my point? A, would anyone as left-wing as Andrew Neil ever be in that position, however good an interviewer? And B, why did Gary Lineker get done over for his tweets, but Andrew Neil never did?
Oh, just on the tweets, first of all, I don't understand the BBC's policy on the tweets. I just don't understand. I never really did. It seemed completely inconsistent. And I think, they've been burned very badly as a consequence of their mishandling of that affair. The DG very directly himself is responsible for the mishandling of that affair. So, so without getting into, in a way, I don't, the tweets thing is like, they didn't make it clear how this was supposed to operate. It didn't seem to make any sense. It seemed to be one rule for one and one rule for somebody else. So that was mysterious to me. On the other thing, it's hard to a kind of, the only sort of identifiably sort of left person who kind of expressed that was Paul Mason, I suppose, when he was on Newsnight. I think that was,
he was economics editor of Newsnight.
Yeah, economics editor of Newsnight. So he did that. I think ultimately the reason why Andrew had longevity at the BBC and why I back Andrew Neil at the BBC is that, irrespective of these questions, is that he was a brilliant interviewer, like generationally, like the best interviewer probably since Brian Walden, or up there with Jeremy Paxman. And so effective and impartial and fair in the way that he did that, and rigorous. And we talked about the Jeremy Corbyn interview, but he did the same to Boris Johnson. I don't have any doubts about his journalistic ethics in relation to that. We talked about in the Brian Walden story there, and there were some questions about ethics. I didn't have a problem at all, the opposite with Andrew Neil. So that's all I can base it on, really, is that, for my money, he was such a talent that he should still be there, really. He should, he's on Channel 4, which is great at Channel 4, but, he should be the premier political interviewer because he's the best at the job. And so that was why, for me, irrespective of, these issues you raise, I was more than happy that I was able to work with him there.
It is a very, very, very readable book, I have to say, full of all sorts of insights, all sorts of brand new information, which I think people won't be aware. It really shows how the sausage is made, if you like, but just so in a very readable way. And I found it a very, thoroughly enjoyable. Why Is This Lying Bastard Lying to Me by Rob Burley, who, as I've said, I think was a very, very big figure in our democracy because of the position he had as head of these live political programs, which were in charge of interrogating our politicians. So, Rob, it's been a real pleasure to be able to chat to you about such a breadth of issues, from Thatcherism to the very modern day. So congratulations on the book, and thank you for joining us. And do like and subscribe.
No, sorry, I ruined your promo. I ruined your promo. Thank you, Owen. I've really enjoyed it. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see everyone soon.